Imagine if we were able to go back in time to about the year 1950 and tell people what Britain and many other nations had become by the year 2024, and tell them that nations in 2024 are almost more divided and fractured than united, filled with crime, drugs, human trafficking, violence, gangs, and where oppressive ideology and regimes still persecuted their people, and warn them that the UK would one day be exactly like that. They would laugh and say, "Don't be ridiculous. Britain and those nations have armies, police, and strong young men would never allow gangs and criminals on such a scale and never allow them to prevail. The enemies and criminals of Britain would be wiped out in a day." They would also probably call us mad, insane foreign traitors trying to warp their minds with apocalyptic stories. Words to that effect. They would laugh loudly if told that tens of thousands of mainly Islamic men were literally arriving on our shores on boats each year, that we place them in hotels while the nation's people work 40 to 60 hours per week, paying taxes to then see those taxes used to house and feed them, and that we kneel down in sympathy for injustices against one race of people and are slandered as fascist when we called for the end of mass uncontrolled immigration and demanding we put our own nation's people first, and that we are silenced, shouted down and sometimes jailed for briefly rising up in protest against the violence and criminality. They would then say, "We defeated the Nazis, and they had an army, navy, and air force. We'd see it all coming a mile off. So what makes you think we won't be able to stop uncontrolled migration and the criminality from getting a foothold in Britain?" So we'd explain to them that human rights laws prevent us from deporting illegal migrants, criminals, and terrorists, and that the taxpayer pays for their human rights lawyers to prevent us from deporting them. They'd laugh again and say, "Don't be silly. We have the most educated professional lawyers in the world, and we would never allow pro-immigrant lawyers to dictate who should live in Britain. Our authorities and legal system would see them all off in a week." Words to that effect. Then we'd show them the evidence that we have on our laptops and smartphones of the terror attacks, mass looting, knife attacks, attacks on our young women, attacks on police, the violence across each city, the violent attitudes and criminality that is present across the nation, and the rage of the British against all this, and that people were jailed for opposing the lawlessness and opposing those pushing non-British ideology. And they'd also see a Prime Minister give a speech condemning the resistance of the nation, dubbing them far-right and thugs for a brief series of protests and riots. We would show them that dangers and threats to our nation are also rife in other nations around the world, that barely any nation is free from violent criminality, terror threats, and that people in dozens of nations are genuinely worried, angry, and even mobilizing in protest. Imagine how they would feel suddenly realizing that millions of British men died to save the nation, to stop one oppressive ideology, to only be replaced by complete chaos and clashes of culture, the most evil acts of terrorism, with millions of people downtrodden and rubbished for being concerned, angry, and determined in attempts to seize back the nation. The truth is, most of those people who lived through and survived World War II saw the gradual demise of the old Britain, saw it heading towards a wider, bigger, and more uncontrollable war. Most are now not with us anymore. They cannot fight for us anymore. Yet surely we learned how determined they were to save Britain for generations in the future. The people of Britain were not shouted down, silenced, or jailed for battling ambitions of Nazis. And the United Kingdom was victorious and freed from oppression and danger. Somehow Britain lost its way, resting on its laurels, assuming that no nation or people would dare to challenge Britain again. Yet the borders opened up and the people trickled in, many refugees of the war. The trickle became a stream, then a river, then a flood. People mostly accepted the changes, seeing new communities building up, and there was mostly peace. Yet, Britain also slowly let the dangers in, let the criminality become an enterprise of gangs, and allowed anti-Britishness and old-fashioned volatile ideology to spread and flourish. Instead of keeping a watchful eye on the rise of dangers and stamping it out, our leaders merely sat back and watched it happen, seeing it rise to an unstoppable level, similar to how a small company becomes a major corporation, one that becomes too big to fail. Governments have to give people courage and determination to protect our own communities, to root out the most dangerous in society, and not be afraid to expel those from our nation. Our war dead and heroes would not accept the traitors and dangers that they faced. And they saved Britain in the hope that peace would prevail. Yet they could only do so much. Stopping dangers and threats from consuming the nation and the world itself is like stopping a virus. Stop it at the source before it is unstoppable. The UK went through the changes after winning a war 80 years ago, yet while wallowing in victory, it also brought unchecked, unchallenged dangers to Britain. What kind of Britain do we want to prevail? What do we accept and not accept? And what will come next?